Waiting for it to load. Usually, I think we're going to be live, but let me just double check. There we are. Perfect. Hello and welcome to the Mastermind, Body, and Spirit Show. I'm your host, Matt Belair. Today's guest is an American Buddhist teacher and chaplain. He was ordained as a repa. Is it repa or repa?
A repa.
Repa. Yeah, the repa in the Karma Kagio tradition of Tibetan Buddhism by his Eminence Goshir Gyalt-sab Rinpoche. Right. He is passionate about the preservation of the Tantric Buddhist tradition. From 2012 until 2017, he served as the resident-lama and executive director of the New York Goshir Dharma Center and is presently the first dedicated staff chaplain for the New York City Department of Correction. In 2018, he was appointed as executive director of the Division of Chaplaincy and Staff Wellness for New York City Department of Correction and leads all wellness initiatives for the agency. He is the author of the book, Modern Tantric Buddhism. Welcome to the show, Justin von Bujdoss.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. How did I pronounce most of those things? You helped me right at the beginning.
You did awesome.
Yeah, it's complicated, man. It's good to have you on the show. You're obviously doing some really amazing work. You just released a book a little while ago.
That's right. Yeah, it came out last week.
Oh man, yeah! Congratulations on that. It looks really interesting. Why don't you start? Because your bio is pretty deep. I took a few things out of it, but you've been doing a lot. So why don't you give the audience a little bit about who you are, your background, and what you're up to today?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so I'm the head chaplain in New York City Department of Correction right now. But I started off as a Buddhist practitioner, back in the day. Which led me to practicing and traveling in Asia. I spent a lot of time in India from 1995, which is the first time I went, till I still go. I'm going next March. It's been a pretty dedicated part of my life. I'm a parent. I've got three boys, and so that's a big part of my life now as well. But for me, a lot of this book is kind of about learning how to find an engaged Buddhist practice in the world and in difficult places. So before I worked for Correction, I was a hospice chaplain for about 3.5 years, and I covered Brooklyn and Queens and some inpatient facilities in Manhattan. I spent a lot of time with people who were dying. And at the time, I was volunteering at Rikers Island, leading meditation for inmates and for staff there. And it's really this kind of the nexus of difficult emotion and human suffering, and what it means to be practicing in the midst of that is alive for me, and really what inspired a lot of this book. That's
amazing. Well, you kind of brushed over a lot of things there. It's like I'm sure it's a lot longer than that. But what I'm curious about, I guess we'll begin with the book. What are you hoping to share with the book? And just, I guess, for the listeners, what is modern Tantric Buddhism mean?
Yeah. So modern Tantric Buddhism is really Tantric Buddhism applied to our life now, right? But I think that the central kind of aspect of it is stepping into difficult experiences, stepping into, for lack of a better term, the shittiness that we experience on a day-to-day basis. And then within Buddhist communities, how we can be awake around things like whiteness and patriarchy, racism, sexism, homophobia, all of our biases, and begin to take responsibility for those by really kind of getting to know our blind spots and using that as practice. So, we live now in a time where we're so divided, in the United States, right? And there's so much difficulty in terms of identity, politics, and what we can allow ourselves to take responsibility for, and what we can see and respect in other people. And modern Tantric Buddhism is looking at how we can be better by owning a lot of our crap, like owning a lot of the places where we get stuck, the places where we might be privileged and ignore that, right? Or the way we might dominate other people, especially as white men, what you and I are, and to look at the discomfort that arises in that too, and just sit in that and practice with that too. So it's kind of taking meditation off of a cushion, right, into the world, but then also into the complexity of the intersectionality of what it means to be in modern America and the world at this time.
Right. And so what does it exactly mean to be tantric? Like most people associate that with like the tantra and all that kind of stuff, but I don't think that's what you mean.
Sex, yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, really, the tantric aspect of Buddhist practice is interfacing with experience as it arises, right? So visual consciousness, auditory consciousness, olfactory consciousness, and not really holding back on any of them, right? So it's a very life-affirming practice. It's a very appearance-affirming practice. Like, Buddhism often can be described at times as being detached, right? Somewhat intellectual, focused on the developing an understanding of emptiness, right? Which can appear to be at odds with the fullness of our life. Tantra asks us to find liberation in those things that we would typically avoid, right? So emotion, right? Emotion is energy, right? And so in tantric practice, we begin to play around with our emotional reactions to things, right? We recognize the power inherent in that. And we use the power of that to create the causes and conditions for our awakening and to support other people in their awakening process. So that's why in a lot of the art, there's a lot of sexual imagery, and it doesn't necessarily represent actual sex acts as much as it does the passion and the unification of opposites, right? The unification of an experience into an experience of totality, right? Which we can do before the show started, you were talking about having a baby, right? And so all of the emotion and all of the exhaustion, all of the stuff that might arise, right, as a new parent, is all stuff that can be brought into meditation practice. Even though sometimes we want to be on top of our game, and we'll try and kind of push away the stuff that we don't think is conducive to meditation, right? So rather than, try and push all that stuff away so that you can just experience peace, step into your exhaustion, step into your oh man, I need to get up and feed the baby again, kind of, automatic reaction, and find, recognize the nature of the experience in that moment, recognize awareness of those difficult things as they arise.
Right. Yeah. When you're kind of saying that, what it kind of makes me think about is just the idea of so many people talk about shadow work these days, and we're pushing away a lot of the uncomfortable things.
Yeah.
You might be upset. It might be emotions that you don't prefer. And what you're suggesting is a holistic view of those ideas. And what I'm curious about, I know that you were in Nepal, you're telling me before the show, and you've trained extensively and learned extensively in Buddhism. I'm curious your view on where you think Buddhism fits in the modern world today, especially in New York, and some of those principles and philosophies, either that you're sharing in the book or that you found very useful and applicable. Is it meditation? Is it perspectives? One of the things I really like is the Eightfold Path. I think is fantastic. It's just so clear and concise in a way to live and guide your life. And a year ago today, I think it was around this time, there was the Parliament of World Religions that I attended and went to, and there's a lot of different religions there. And Buddhism has been one of my favorites because what I've kind of broken down into a few categories where religion usually will have a consequence. So if you don't do a certain thing, you will have a very intense consequence.
Mhm.
And philosophies, and there might be a better word for it, but that's like Buddhism and the Eastern traditions, is like you could do that and you're not going to have this crazy consequence. It's more like it guidelines and way of life. It's a little bit looser. But even in Buddhism, when I went to China and I was training with the Shaolin monks, they took what I learned in Nepal
Mhm.
and they still called it Buddhism, but it was nothing like I learned from the Tibetan monks. It was a completely different thing. And
Mm.
so I'm curious your view on just generally what Buddhism is for the philosophy and some of the practical things that someone can use and apply to their lives.
Yeah. So okay. So obviously meditation is vital, right? And so that can be anything from a very basic meditation practice like shamatha, where you learn how to focus and anchor your mind on your breath, right? To basically kind of gain a mastery of simplicity, right? We're running. I mean, we take New York City, like we're running around all the time. Brooklyn, we run around all the time, and everywhere in America right now, our lives are busy, right? We've got our cell phones, we've got social media, we've got all this stuff going all the time. So Buddhism offers us a really good counterbalance to a lot of that busyness, because the busyness, I mean, on one level, it allows us to get so much done, right? And in the West, and particularly in America, I, in one way, you could say that we're very advanced technologically, right? But sometimes that comes at the expense of almost feeling a little enslaved to the technology, right? And which causes unhappiness. And so, in a very basic way, meditation allows us to, you could say, sometimes get some room, and then at other times it's like it can cut through and crack some of that automatic almost like addiction that we might have to social media and things like that, which is really important, I find, in my life. Now I'm also a chaplain, and I work on Rikers Island, and I'm surrounded by chaos and violence and things like that. And Buddhism allows, because it's more oriented around experience, it gives me the room to examine what's happening to me when I'm coping with being in really intense circumstances. So I could be attending to a member of staff who may have died in a car accident, right? And it's late at night. I get a phone call. I need to run out to a hospital and then maybe notify the parents of this person who's passed away. And it's all really intense. Just describing it doesn't sound intense, but telling somebody's parents that your grown child has died is gut wrenching, right? And so for me, my Buddhist practice allows me to, as I'm in that moment, check in, and I feel my stomach is just turning while you watch the parents scream and cry, right? Um, I allow myself to check in with my breath, right? Because I need to hold the space for everybody going through this really intense stuff. If I lose it, there's like, it's just gonna fall apart. So the Buddhist practice for me acts as an anchor to be able to hold space for others as they go through what can be, a life-altering, difficult experience. Or in the cases of working with people who suffer from trauma, the same thing, to be able to occupy a place that's stable for the person who feels that they have no ground because they've just got through something that's so damaging or unsettling, or something of that nature. Now, like, when I was a hospice chaplain, I mean, Buddhism has such an amazing philosophy around death, that I got to see that play out in amazing detail. And there's a good portion of the book that kind of is born out of my reflections, both as a Buddhist practitioner and then a Buddhist teacher around death, and then as a hospice chaplain, looking at what it's like for people to go through the dying process, and what it's like for their mental experience to go through as they're actively dying, and then right into the death experience, and then also how to be with loved ones who are coping with loss, like so bereavement, pre-bereavement, and things like that. And so like the philosophy part is really amazing because it really asks us to look at our reactions, and we go through our daily lives, sometimes pretty conscious and aware, but then often it's kind of like a pinball game and we're just like, like you're just reacting all the time, right? With very little attention. And then we'll find ourselves, we go from point A to like point Z, really quickly. And then we wonder like, why am I here right now, man? I'm like freaking out. But all we need to do sometimes is learn how to come back to our body, come back to our breath, right? And just understand, check in, and it's like, what am I experiencing right now? I'm freaking out. Why am I freaking out? Let me take a little bit of space. Let me slow this down. And that allows us to kind of come back to a place where we can make a more informed decision, right? So when I used to teach meditation to inmates and correction officers at the same time, I looked at doing this as a way to allow people the room to interject a little bit of like conscious awareness when you're all hyped up and angry, right? Let's say you're right about to be assaulted by a highly assaultive inmate, right? This person's like throwing feces or gonna splash you with urine, and that this person has a history of doing that, and they got their cup, and like you can get triggered like it's nobody's business, or you can learn how to be like, all right, man, I got, I'm not gonna just lose it, because sometimes then you make poor decisions, and those poor decisions can hurt somebody, they can hurt your career and things like that. And simultaneously to the for the inmate population, I mean, getting pissed off at correction officers, it's easy to do, but how does that benefit you when you're in the custody in the correctional system, right? If you're gonna lash out. So, and I mean, this is the case for parents, it's a case for teenagers towards their parents, learning how to get a little bit of space. In some way, you could say take responsibility for who we are and how our reactions happen, and then how we relate to experience as it arises. So like a big part of the tantric path is learning to allow a appearance, like whatever is happening right now, to just happen, right? And we could have all of the conceptual kind of reactions in our minds going on, but what happens if we just kind of let that burn out, like a candle, right? Because our mind is just going to constantly be like, oh wow, check out that guy's hat, check out his beard, check out the mic, check out the background, the background's cool. We could keep going, and our mind just keeps going and going. But like, when do we have peace? So it's ultimately rooted, just like every other Buddhist tradition, in the experience of peace and awakening, right? And the desire for all beings to have experience a cessation of suffering. But the tantric model allows us in a really dynamic way to jump into all of the busyness, to all of the, depending on how we're feeling in the day, the bullshit we might be feeling, and the beauty, right? I mean, because life has a lot of beauty in it, and how there's an amazing thing about appreciating beauty without being consumed by needing to own it, right? And so the tantric path allows us to be able to just appreciate amazing things for being amazing, and really engage them, really feel them, right? Really interact with them, right? Without holding back, all the while understanding that this is not something I can take with me, to the grave. This is not something I can take with me, the next life. This is not something I can own.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I definitely agree with all that. And what I really love about Buddhism is the idea of the observer. You're saying you might be going through these challenging things and you feel these emotions, and you might feel frustration, you might feel anger, you might feel these things. And what I've noticed in, let's say, the maybe new age or positive vibes or whatever, people, I don't, you can have that view of like, it's like they almost don't want to go through that. It seems like, oh, it's always going to be perfect. What I've observed and think right now, and it could change, I don't know. But when I started studying enlightenment and things like that, I was like, oh, there's going to get to a point where I'm going to be floating around on a cloud, maybe like this. It's going to be awesome. And my consciousness will be different and everything will be hunky dory all the time. And it's going to be great. What I think, it's more grounded in kind of what you're saying. It's like you observe the anger, you observe the frustration, and it seems like we don't want those things. I'm not angry, right? I'm not an angry person. I'm a positive person. But if you do something that bothers me, my reaction might be anger. But the more you get to that center point of non-attaching to the outside, like your feces example is intense, but I use the example on the podcast of, growing up a man. And so I am, let's say, in high school, and somebody calls me a loser. Well, I got to go fight that guy because he's telling me I'm a loser, and I defend myself because I'm angry now and I got to prove my self-worth. It's no different there. It's just a more intense scenario. Same thing with dealing with family members, dealing with a boss, they could be totally pieces of crap doing terrible things, and it doesn't have to affect your emotional state. It does take time, but over practice, the first time I say, like, it's going to happen, you're going to feel angry, you're going to want to rip their head off, and you might do it. And if you do it, just, okay, next time,
Mhm.
see if you can take a breath. The next time you might feel angry, but this time you don't deck them, you don't react, you don't feel emotion and then reaction. Then
Right.
you keep going down the path, you might feel really mad, and then it's a little bit easier and it starts to die down to the point where I give the examples like, I wonder what's wrong with my boss. He just came in here, he was totally unreasonable, very mean and rude. I wonder what's going on, and you have like compassion for them. And that's a possibility. And for me, that's closer to, the awakened being, the enlightened one. It's very human. I used to think it was a superhuman idea, but it's actually a very simple concept, not easy to do, but that's the part of the awareness training. Because what is it that's getting mad? Is it, what part of me is getting mad? And so when you can observe it with observing things in meditation, and when you meditate, you realize how much of a lunatic you are. And somebody was like telling me today, it's like, I can't meditate. I was like, great. No one can, over time that, the teleprompter of your mind,
Mhm.
it's like crazy, the first times you meditate.
Right.
Over time, it gets less crazy. And then over time, maybe there's gaps in the teleprompter. But even if you've meditated for a long time, you might have a great teleprompter day and so much internal dialogue is going nuts, but you observe it. That's the whole point. So when you're out in the world, something external happens, an internal thing happens, but you ultimately get to make that choice. And that's freedom. That's a very big distinction, not being run by your emotions. It's a huge concept. So simple. But I think that for me is more towards what I would consider an awakened being, an enlightened being. It's somebody that's able to do that. I'd be curious to hear what you think of that rant.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm 100% down. I mean, it's basically about letting go, right? And when we get triggered, and when our identity gets triggered, then we just hold on, right? And it's like, hold on for the ride. I'm gonna be pissed off. I'm not gonna let go. I'm not gonna relent, and then we're all gonna end up in a bad place, right? Whether we like it or not. But it is that aspect of awareness, which is, it's really about spaciousness, and how can we pull spaciousness or blend spaciousness into our experience at any given time. And in the beginning, when you start a meditation practice, it can be very overwhelming when we experience just how busy our minds are, right? And it doesn't have to be like, crazy intense emotions. It's just like almost like restless leg syndrome, but for your mind, right? It's just, moving, like, thing after thing after thing. And but I think you're completely right. Like, within especially the Karma Kagio tradition, when we talk about shamatha meditation, in the beginning they say, the mind is almost as if, it's like a mountain river between two in a gorge, right? It's just like rushing, right? So we sit down to meditate. Like, oh, I'm going to do this because this is good for me. I'm going to do this because this is going to bring me peace. And then you notice like, wow, this is crazy. This is intense. But over time, if we can allow ourselves to be kind to ourselves and just be like, look, man, I'm not going to judge. I'm just going to keep going slowly, slowly, slowly. Eventually that experience becomes more spacious. And then eventually it becomes even more spacious. And within that experience of spaciousness is exactly what you're talking about, is this ability to discern whether or not I need to just jump up and freak out whenever I get triggered. Right. And sometimes, it's just the way it is. Like that thing is so triggering that we make make a mistake, so to speak, and get triggered. Right. But the beautiful thing about it is like, as you said before, like it's not like you're going to go to hell. You just got triggered. And so you become aware of that, right? You recognize that and then bring yourself back. Right. I mean, there's no we fail all the time. And in the Zen tradition, you talk about how like the path is just impossible and a path of impossibility. And in a way, like it is. I mean, I definitely believe that awakening is possible. And I believe that awakening is a possibility in one lifetime. And that's usually born out of millions of mistakes, millions of little screw ups. But that's where wisdom comes from. To understand ourselves and understand, wow, that thing is really hard,
Yeah. When you're speaking, it reminded me of the quote, and I love this quote. It says, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection."
Mhm.
And it goes into your internal dialogue. And you're also speaking about awareness. And the other thing that you're speaking about that is important is meditation's a practice. The first time that I sat down to meditate, I was like for a minute, I'd meditate. I don't know if I was meditating as a kid, like when I was young and doing martial arts, like really young, I was meditating, but I didn't know what I was doing. I don't know if it was effective. It might have been, but in my teens, I really picked it up again. I started studying it and I sat down for a minute and I got out, and it's a practice though, because that awareness gives you choice. It's an observation. And even if, let's say you get into a funk and you're depressed and you're angry for a week, maybe you've been angry for 10 years. You live in New York. There's plenty of people who've been angry their whole life. And so, right. If you're used to that, then the awareness can break that pattern. Just ask yourself, so what do I want? I notice that I'm angry. Is this a reasonable thing to be angry about? Right. I'm angry about, somebody at work. I'm angry. You can find a million reasons to be angry. And with awareness, you can choose something else, and it's going to take practice. It's also how your mind is hardwired. You have this big neural map to says fire off to be angry. You're angry about this guy's driving. You're angry about that person. It's just wired to find reasons for you to be angry. That's what your wiring is doing. But over time, when you catch that and you're like, you notice you're angry and that wiring's going, you say, stop. You bring awareness, come back to your breath. So what do I want? Even though this is, this person, there's a reason, there's an external reason for me to be angry, whatever it is. I choose to feel a little bit more peaceful right now. I choose to feel calm. And the thing is too, especially being a martial artist and fighting, and the samurai back in the day, the best fighters do not fight angry. You can't. Your life is on the line. You have to be so focused. And it's the same idea with navigating this world. And the other important thing that I like in Buddhism, Alan Watts said, in Buddhism, they say life is suffering. And he's like, my translation, it's more like life is frustrating.
Mhm.
And every day we get up, there's frustrating things going to happen. We know that it is frustrating. And the better equipped, the more equipped we are to come in with awareness, learn how to have a more empowering perspective, we're going to have a little bit more freedom. And like you said, a little bit more space, because it's like emotional glue. Somebody cuts you off in traffic and then this black oily goo gets on you and it's your negative emotions, but you're doing it to yourself.
Mhm.
You're the one doing it to yourself, and you can actually clean yourself off just by coming back to the breath, deciding what you want, allowing that to be what it is. And it takes practice over time. So I'd love if you want to add some comments on that, you're more than welcome. And also I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more about the Buddhist perspective on death and what you learned from working in a hospice. I think that's so important. It's such an interesting process. You learn a lot there. So I'd love to hear the most important things you've learned and also the Buddhist view on death and maybe what happens over there. What's the
Sure.
deal?
Yeah, I mean, while you were talking, what I was hearing was born of meditation is a sense of personal ethics, right? And that's an important part of all Buddhist practice as well. And it doesn't necessarily mean that oh, I'm going to follow this set of vows, but for some people that works. But the practice of meditation allows us to understand the way our mind works, and it allows us to understand the way we relate to others, including the world. And as we gain a sense of greater spaciousness, we begin to understand how to be, right? Which is basically what ethics is a way to how to be in relationship to others that fits into a model that reduces the suffering for all beings, right? So once we realize that, wow, I actually have a tremendous amount of power in my reactivity, right? I can actually learn to kind of step away from difficult experiences when I know that I'm going to be overwhelmed, right? Or that I should transform these experiences to create a change in my experience. And so I just wanted to touch on ethics just briefly, because I think it's an important thing, and I think it gets underlooked, especially in contemporary times with the whole mindfulness scene, where mindfulness is discussed and shared pretty much everywhere, and there are aspects of it that are really good, but these things come out of a rich tradition which has ethics woven into it, which is important. But as for the death experience, I mean, the Tantric Buddhist tradition, or the Vajrayana tradition, goes into incredible detail around what the dying process is like. And typically it's kind of it happens before actual death. So we like to think of death, or we have a habit of thinking of death kind of in a really dramatic way, that like, oh, now I'm laying here, I'm dying, maybe suddenly or maybe slowly. But in the Buddhist tradition, death begins sometimes like months before that. It's basically said that in a nutshell, you could say that death is the process of consciousness kind of separating from the body, and this very fine level of consciousness called Vajra mind moving from one existence to the next, right? And this thing is almost like an indestructible type of consciousness that goes from one body to the next body. But how that separation occurs is really different. So it's a little bit like midwifery, right? So like I've got 3 sons. I was at their births. Each birth was really different, right? And in hospice, it's exactly the same way. Like each death is very different. The kind of individual karmic propensities that people have, like the way that we react to things, play into it. So if somebody is really fearful, and if you come onto hospice, typically, in theory, the best of all worlds is like you have about 6 months before after dying. And of course, that's really hard to predict. So sometimes someone might come on a hospice and they've got a month, or in some cases, a couple days. But the beauty of working with people is that if you meet with people who are very fearful, right, or experience a lot of anxiety around either this experience they're going to be going into, or a lot of trepidation about saying goodbye. Like, I don't want to say goodbye to my loved one, my husband or my wife or my kids, or this life I've built, right? That's hard. So to sit with people, and in some cases perform meditation with them. So I had a good number of hospice patients who would want to, some of them had an existing meditation practice, and we'd really kind of like tailor make it to this next experience they were moving into, and how their bodies were changing, maybe getting weaker, nauseous, maybe couldn't sit up. So, people would lay down and we'd meditate. And then others were like Catholic patients who were like, I'm so anxious. I don't know how to get through this. And then I'd introduce this idea of meditation and introduce it in a way that was affirming of their faith, but where we could just get into the nuts and bolts of just trying to relax the mind, right? And trying to ease into the next moment, no matter how uncomfortable that was. So there are some really great texts that describe what it's like when one consciousness, like the auditory consciousness, blends into another consciousness, into another consciousness, and into the elements, eventually to this experience of Vajra mind. And it's described in the book. I share 3 vignettes in the book of working with 3 different hospice patients, and just how different the dynamics of the dying process were, both physiologically, but then also just in terms of like family relationship, right? Where like, in one case, and one of the people was a Buddhist teacher, and so here you had a Buddhist going through the dying process, being chaplained by me, another Buddhist. And I was witness to this person kind of struggling with their idea of what an ideal Buddhist death should be, kind of failing to recognize that, like, this experience sucks for me right now. I'm in a lot of pain. This person had a lot of their students around caring for them, and that brought them a lot of anxiety and a sense of lack of privacy. And then it was hard for their students to watch their teacher dying. So the dying process is, we go through our own internal process, right? Of letting go. Sometimes that's easy and sometimes that's hard. But then what's also connected to it is the environmental connection to us, right? So you can have family who are like, I don't ever want you to go, Matt. Like, I never want you to die, right? And then, circumstances get to where they are and you're at the end of life. And that could be like a curse to you, right? Where you're just like, no, I see this body's going. I need to go. And they're like, no, you can't go. And that pressure and that fear of letting people down can really play into, that process of letting go, so that we're not letting go very easily. There are a couple cases where actually in a lot of cases, people were beginning to see relatives who had passed on before they had, in terms of time. So, and in some really amazing cases, people would see a twin that died, maybe when they were both 6 years old. Their twin sister died, and I literally sitting, with them in their bedroom, and they're like, my twin sister's like sitting, at the end of the bed. Like, can you see them? I'm like, no, I can't. And then, my role as a chaplain was really to kind of sit with them and ascertain, like, what is this person trying to tell you? Are you scared? Right? And there were 2 memorable experiences where there were people that were terrified that, I'm going to go to hell or something like that. And were literally clawing at the bedside furniture as they died. And then there were others who would, I would be in the room with them, and it's as if their consciousness in that moment was beginning to pass to a much more subtle place. And they could see lots of people around in the room, that I couldn't see. And they're like, oh, they're telling me to come. I'm gonna leave soon. So it's a very, very different kind of chaplaincy than I do now, which is just really raw and intense. But it's a really amazing way to look at the traditional teachings on death and dying, and then test them out, almost, through the scientific process, through being with people going through that experience. There's nothing like it. Really powerful.
Wow. Well, that sounds really intense. And I'm curious, were there people that, and I know that my aunt had passed last year, and she was really worried.
Mhm.
And there came a point where she's in the hospital, my mom said that something happened. We don't know if it's a dream or something she had, where she then found peace with it. And I was curious if you found that to be like common, like that universal force, maybe God, maybe the universe or something comes in for the most part, coming in and assuring people in their own way. And the other thing is, do people have insights? Like, did you notice any profound insights, whether it was regrets or, you know, things that they wish they didn't, like any common themes in that, like life advice, or like, you know, now that I'm at the end of my life, this is the thing that I wish that I had corrected long ago?
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, with the latter point, like so I covered home hospice patients, a lot of them in Brooklyn, and the nurses that I worked with and social workers were kind of like, Justin is good with these like Italian tough guys, who are at the end of life, who they can't talk to their priest because they don't want to seem weak, Um, and so I would meet with them just privately, right? They would say like, I don't want my wife present, because I want to like kind of break down and just be vulnerable, right? And there's this one guy. There were actually two. This one really intense guy was like admitted to me before he died. He was like, yeah, I was in the mafia and all this stuff, and I hurt a lot of people, and I was involved in a lot of bad things. And it's you know you end up taking on, or I ended up taking on the role quite a bit as a confessor, right? And I would listen to people just share with me kind of that stuff that they didn't want to share with other family members. They want to talk to their family about how they made their money or that kind of stuff. But this one guy was like, look, you know I hurt people, it wasn't good, but it was also a long time ago. And I was like, that's okay. And he started crying, and I was like, what's going on for you right now? And he was like, I don't believe in God. I'm like, okay, like that's okay. I understand how that can be hard for you, but I'm not judging you at all. And he's like, I believe in aliens. And he was like, I really believe in them, and I've been keeping that secret from my wife for like 30 years, and my kids. And he had this amazing like internal theology of extraterrestrials, like being in relationship to him, and it totally worked for him. I think it's kind of interesting. there are We tend to kind of categorize the world um, by a certain set number of philosophical systems. But when we look at like all the people in the world, we all experience life differently, right? And so you might be inspired by Buddhism, I'm inspired by Buddhism, right? But you might be inspired by something else as well, right? And myself as well. And so and they could be different things and at odds. And I think that there is something to be said about you could call it a higher power, or the Buddhist tradition will talk about Buddha nature, that there's this innate part of us that I think tends to connect towards something positive and something meaningful, especially in the dying process. And there was one person I wrote about in the book who had this recurring dream of a man standing outside of his apartment window, in the dark, like in like his body was kind of in shadows, so he couldn't see him, but he was kind of scared. And we would sit together, the hospice patient was like, he's out there right now, like I can feel it. And I spent time with him, exploring who this person could be. Does it have to be a scary person, right? And over time, we kind of landed on the fact that maybe this guy is your ferryman. Maybe this is going to be the person who's going to guide you to the afterworld, wherever it is you want to go. And when he had that shift, I led him in this visualization kind of meditation around offering him, the ferryman, a gift. And I was like, just make it a gift that's basic. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate. And he offered it to him. And the next day, the patient died. And he had been holding on so tightly he's like, that guy's terrifying. I don't want to go near him, So I think that we hold so much power to connect innately to the vastness of the universe, right? And so it could be, in the form of God, or it could be in the form of Buddha, or the, Shiva, or Kali, Durga, whatever. And the name to me isn't important, or the appearance of that divinity really isn't important as much as supporting people to be able to touch that. And again, I've probably been witness or part of over 300 active deaths, in hospice over the time I was working. And I can only really think of two death experiences that quote unquote went badly for the person who died. Most other people, even if they suffered from kind of advanced dementia or Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, still died very peacefully, which I tend to take as something reassuring. I think that there's something innate about humans, and maybe all beings, where it's actually maybe we're just naturally going to connect to expansiveness. But expansiveness is scary because, again, kind of going back to Buddhist practice, like it's not referential. It's not referent to our ego identity, right? That kind of expansiveness is beyond ego, and that's what's scary. It's scary to let go of being Matt and being a dad and being a partner and all of that stuff when that's meaningful to you, right? But then at the same time, when we're right on the edge of the membrane of expansiveness, the death process is piercing through that membrane potentially into the infinite, into vast awakened mind, which is both scary and liberating at the same time. And that's kind of like our weird paradox, I think, as humans, where we do we create the most beauty in the name of faith and spiritual practice, but then out of fear, we create horror as well. And I think that there's something very powerful in that contradiction and in that paradox that somebody can tell someone else about it, but it isn't until we kind of like kids, like get our fingers dirty playing in our experience and playing in our story and our history and this, inner symbology that's important to us, that we begin to understand what that's all about. And then once we develop some kind of internal mastery of it, then I don't think awakening is that difficult, but the process is messy, and messiness is something that we're kind of all taught is bad.
Well, you shared a lot of things there I find fascinating, and what's kind of coming up for me as I listen is the idea that I don't know if it's the Tibetan Book of the Dead or where I heard this, but it was the idea that through meditation it allows you to consciously enter dreams, and then also at the death point to consciously go into the next world, to bring that amount of awareness to the next phase. And obviously that kind of awareness would change your life. And you also spoke about, that source, that bigger thing. And through meditation, I've experienced that, and some very, very profound experiences of an awareness or a consciousness or an experience that's way beyond my understanding. I don't have the language for it because it's something that my mind can't perceive at all. It's like an ant trying to speak English if it became conscious. It's not in the vocabulary of understanding. I think Alan Watts says something like it's like a knife trying to cut itself. It's just so beyond that, but it's there. It's always there. And the times I've had those experiences, that it made me not afraid of death. I've had 4, I think, near-death experiences, and one of them I was afraid because I was going to get hurt. It was going to be a painful one. I was afraid of that. It's going to fall off a cliff, for frig's sake. So I was like, oh, shoot. But I wasn't like afraid of what was next. I felt very comfortable in knowing that whatever this consciousness is, whatever the heck's happening here, the simulation is, I'm going to be okay. That was how I feel. I don't know for sure because I haven't been on the other side. So I'll say that. But it's because of meditation and taking my awareness and shooting it into the abyss, into the thing that connects everything. And it takes practice and it takes time. But what it makes you realize is how small your consciousness is and how very limited it is in understanding anything and how it functions, because even as your identity moving around the day and everything that you've learned, that consciousness has to pull up the memory, recall it properly, articulate it. It's operating on such a minimal amount of awareness, where all of you is operating at such a higher, deeper level of awareness. So I'm curious your thoughts on, what you feel like an awakening is like for an individual, and how maybe somebody would have that awakening. And also Buddhism does talk about life without suffering, more happiness. What would you say to people who are suffering, and just how they can have a little bit more peace, a little bit more calm, and a little less suffering in their lives?
Yeah. So with the latter point, I mean, I would kind of go back to just basic meditation. Like, start at cultivating awareness of mind, right? And so in the Vajrayana or Tantric tradition, we talk about nature of mind. So practices that are geared towards understanding what mind is, right? Because shamatha is great, right? But it's easily kind of misinterpreted as a very basic meditation, right? Focus your mind on your breath, and eventually you also focus your mind on the experience that's happening in the moment. But what the whole goal is to understand the nature of mind, and part of that is, where is the mind, right? And where is the edge of your mind, right? And where does mind end? Does it end with time, or is it this continuum that just exists across time and space? And so it's meditation is potentially, depending on the kinds you're doing, it's such an amazing practice, because the same instruction after 5 years of practicing it is like a pearl. It's this like treasured jewel that can unlock your experience of mind in such a deep way. As you mentioned earlier, but it is a practice, right? So there's a lot of wrestling over the course of a quote unquote career as a meditator, where sometimes you go through these dull patches, sometimes you're just passionate about it. But awakening experiences are possible, and they're possible in many ways. I mean, when I was once sitting in this interdisciplinary team meeting in hospice, where doctors and everyone's talking, and then I remembered that I had a near-death experience when I was young. I must have been like 5 years old, and that convinced me in the moment that is why I was so comfortable in hospice, because that experience was so visceral. In that moment, I had this experience. I had fallen into a pool as a young kid, and I didn't know how to swim. And after a certain period of time, I don't know how long it was, the vantage point from that experience was like from 30 feet above. So I saw myself floating in the pool, went face down. I saw myself sinking down into the pool. And then I saw my aunt jump in and grab me and then pulled me up. And then the moment she pulled me up, it was my locus of awareness was my body. So it was just like sucked right back into me. And so I'll go back to that experience, and I can still kind of like viscerally feel it, right? But that for me is a form of proof that there is an experience of awareness that's much bigger than this one singular Justin, or this one singular Matt, or this one singular, person, the experience of the person watching this podcast. And there are other kinds of meditation experiences that can happen where we're basically faced with understanding how limited this ego experience of like illusion of myself as a singular being living for all practical purposes at odds with everything around us, right? Which is what causes us to accumulate things, which is what causes us to have conflict with other people, which causes us to, you could even say destroy the environment. Like we're just kind of senselessly using things, right? When we're able to really hone our practice and we can have these experiences that allow us to rest in a sense of vastness that allows us to understand and appreciate the order of complexity, but also the simplicity of everything. Everything on earth and in this universe is happening, right? Automatically. It's just happening. We're the ones, when we get stuck in this ego identity, that are like, like, holding on and grabbing, and we just are pushing away, like, I don't want to have that experience, right? But that's all an illusionary, like, relationship to whatever is happening, and that's the interesting thing about the death process too. It's innate. It's going to happen. It's going to happen to you and me and everybody else. And yet, when you get into the kind of life cycle of the experience of death, it becomes, for some people, such an emotional time suck because, like, it's this like great drama that just has no ending and is just, intense. But so there are practices in the Tantric tradition like Mahamudra, Dzogchen. They're the kind of more 6 yogas of Naropa kind of practices that are aimed at being able to maintain awareness of the essence of mind in waking state, and then, as you point out, in dreaming state, and then death state, and post-death state. And in the beginning, these are a little bit like calisthenics, like, they're practices that you do to kind of build up your ability to maintain an awareness. But over time, like a good athlete or a good artist, these things become very automatic, right? So it's not really that, you have to do 50 push-ups every day to remain, strong and limber, but you do a certain amount, you have the experiences that end up formulating the solid ground for your practice. And then you can just move around, so it's a training like any other training. But once you attain some level of mastery, and it doesn't have to be, mastery, you're able to have a sense of lightness around just the everyday experience of life. And you'll meet people. I mean, the Dalai Lama is like this. There are a lot of Buddhist teachers and teachers of a variety of faith traditions where life is just happening. They're not taking it so personally, right? So, like, again, we live in this incredibly complex time of a tremendous amount of angst and conflict. And I think in our hearts, we just want to let that go, right? But in order to let it go, we need to take responsibility for all of the energy we invest in holding on, And so tantric practice is about just letting go.
I really like that last part. It reminds me of the Zen teaching. I think there's 3 of them. It's non-resistance, non-judgment, maybe non-attachment. it's about the same as resistance. I'd have to look into it, but it's just resisting life. It's like it's not supposed to be this way. You always want to change something, and like you said, it's the grasping. It's like we're forcing, and we're just forcing in our mind, and we're forcing energetically. And even with meditation, you notice that you're grasping at thoughts, and that's the idea, and that's how we're living. And that's a way of like an operating system of your consciousness. Let's just say it's like 1991 Windows,
Mhm.
and it's operating that way. And what Buddhism and what other practices are offering is like maybe it's 2019 Mac. You know what I mean? But these are ancient operating systems. As the ancient Buddhist texts, there's ancient lineages that are offering a different operating system, but it takes some effort to run the coding, because the coding is so freaking ingrained in who you are. It's ingrained, and you got to go in to that hardwiring. But once you kind of change the apps, you change the operating system a little bit and how it functions, it's a whole new thing.
Mhm.
And once you have that ability through some training, then how you operate in the world is totally different. You feel differently. You are inspired more. You're in spirit. Your consciousness is different. But
Yeah.
it does take a little bit of effort, and it does take a little bit of training. And so you got to be willing to suspend disbelief. You got to be willing to try and get some feedback. And so for me, I've just kind of tried what these suggestions were super intensely. Recently last year it was the cold training. Everyone's going nuts about the cold training. So I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna do the cold training to the maximum degree. And I'm not going to train, and I'm not going to do the breathing. And so I did it, and I had a great experience, and it was super challenging. And it was just an experience that I can have a direct understanding of what it did for me. And so when someone talks about it, um, I can understand them as well. But at the same time, every time I'm doing these practices, it's just a test. It's just to experience and to keep trying, keep doing something, keep getting feedback, keep engaging. And so if everyone's talking about meditation in a way, give it a try.
Mhm.
Try a different way. See how it works for you. See what's going on. But because of this mystery around so many of these concepts, people end up doing nothing. And that operating system, and the other thing about the operating system people should understand is that it's designed to save itself. It
Mhm.
wants everything to stay the same. It doesn't want to be frigged with. That's the way it's set up. And so it doesn't want you, it's going to give you excuses in that operating system not to frig with it. And
Yeah.
so that's a part of the battle. It's a part of the challenge. So do you want to add anything onto that, or you want me to throw a question at you?
Well, I'll just say, like, there's the third portion of the book on mind has three meditation instructions back from medieval India, which were revolutionary at the time, and they're still revolutionary right now for much the same reason, that they're basic and they're beautiful in that way, in that they're very simple. And yet the weird part of them is training and letting go. So you build this formal meditation training in just letting everything go. And there's something that happens where we need to build up this effort to relax the mind beyond time and space. But in the beginning, it's this weird conceptual framework that we build to hold a mind beyond time and space. Um, so I like the analogy that you brought up. And it really is, I think, good meditation practice is really like practicing art, where or music, right, where you pick up an instrument, and in the beginning it's really formal, right, so you learn how to pick or something, and you're playing, and you learn exercises. But after a while, when you've achieved a level of comfort and mastery of the instrument, it doesn't really matter, like, those things are important, right? But it's more about just playing automatically what's arising, right?
Mm.
Or paint. My dad's a painter, right? So I grew up, like watching him make art, and that, I think, influenced my meditation practice more than anything else. Even more than anything people in Asia told me, because there's this, and the process of experimentation, and you can't, unless you develop, so the subtitle of the book is Embodiment and Authenticity in Dharma Practice. Like, so until we learn how to be authentically us in relationship to these instructions and embodied as Matt or as Justin, and with all of the strengths and all of the weaknesses that we might have, then we're kind of chasing this operating system that is good, right? And that exists, this all this like, crazy way of breaking the coding we have. But we need to understand us first, or maybe simultaneously to having this meditation practice. So it's like weirdly very complicated, and then even weirdly more simple than anything in the world.
Mm. Well, your analogy of the music and the instrument, I think, is really amazing. I love that analogy too. Can you share the meditation instructions?
Yeah,
For this
sure.
temple? I'd love to hear 'em.
Let me, I'll pull up one. I mean, this one's pretty well known in the sense that a lot of people have written it about it, and it's just 6 points. So it's called Tilopa's 6 Nails. So Tilopa was this tantric yogi who lived in 9th, 10th century India. And he was kind of the first human teacher in the Karma Kagio tradition. But he developed this series of instructions, or they maybe arose posthumously.
What do you mean by human teacher?
Well, from like, yeah, no, sorry, it might sound weird. So like, every Buddhist tradition kind of like starts from Buddha, or excuse me, like a cosmic Buddha, right? It's just like this, like ends up being kind of like an anthropomorphized manifestation of enlightenment, right? So according to the tradition, Tilopa's teacher, like guru, was Vajradhara, who is not really human and is more like an anthropomorphized experience of awakening, right? So Tilopa was kind of like the first person to formulate this school of Buddhist practice, and then it's not really helped by, like in the Tibetan tradition, they anthropomorphize everything. So there's like, female Buddhas that are awakening and male Buddhas that are awakening, and they weren't necessarily real people, even though you'll see the images. But so this one is, I really like this translation by Ken MacLeod, who's a kind of great boomer Buddhist teacher. So the first point is, don't recall, let go of what's past. Right. So actually, Matt, I'm going to ask you to just kind of sit in meditation right now.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to.
Cool. Go for it. All right. So just take a moment to take a couple of deep breaths, and with every inhalation, inhale clear white light, and with every exhalation, just exhale, anything that feels negative or anything you don't want present right now. So in this moment, focus your breath, focus your awareness on your breath. Just allow yourself to feel every inhalation and exhalation. And let your mind settle. And I'll just go through these 6 points. So don't recall. Let go of what has passed. Don't imagine. Let go of what may come. Don't think. Let go of what is happening now. Don't examine. Don't try to figure anything out. Don't control. Don't try to make anything happen. rest. Relax right now and rest. And so this instruction is really rooted in trying to experience the mind's true nature, right? So it's not about past experience. It's not about the anticipatory experience of what's going to happen next, right? Experiencing the mind directly isn't something that we have to be engaged in doing. It's automatic, right? It's not something that's new that we need to blend into our experience in this particular moment. Right?
Well, that was a really great meditation, and you know, when I go through it and experience it and just listen to the points, it is everything about the mind. You know, there's not a missing element there of what the mind may try and do. And one, you know, they're so good in the sense is like, don't try and figure anything out. And that was the big one for me. I was like, I'm always trying to figure crap out.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's not and they understood through these practices how the mind works. This is understanding your software and how it works. And that's why in Zen and in Buddhism, they'll talk about these things like judgment and comparison and attachment. It's because they've examined, they've looked at the operating, and it's like, hey, this is what this thing's going to do. Here is some awareness around that so you can have more freedom. And it's not just the mind that is pulling you around, then creating an emotion, then creating an action. And so these are paramount things to understand, and they seem simple, you know, and unless you do them, you don't really understand how powerful it is. And when, you know, I've been breaking down Zen Athlete and teaching that a little bit more, and I'm really passionate about it. And the reason being is that when I break it down to its simplest form, the elements that I want to teach kids are, you know, when you go to take a basketball shot, you clear your mind. An individual who has the ability to clear their mind in an instant and come into the breath and understand that, it's a fundamental shift in consciousness. It's a fundamental shift in the quality of your life. And so these little tiny points here, if you take somebody through those practices and they just go 10 days and they're going to give 5 minutes to those concepts, it's going to seep into their life immediately. And it takes a lifetime to master because but you might get to that instrument a little bit quicker, but you're going to do it with more understanding, more freedom, more happiness, less suffering, because, you know, you might judge something, but you won't. Then I learned actually on the podcast I was interviewed on today about the two arrows of I don't know if it was Buddha or Krishna or something, but the first arrow is judgment, right? And then the second one is you judging yourself and stabbing yourself for judging. And it's so interesting that that's what the mind does. And without awareness, we're basically whipping ourselves and making ourselves feel worse, when what we need to do is just understand our operating system a little bit better. And there's a reason that these teachings are old. Do you have any idea how old that meditation is?
So I want to say 9th century, 10th century.
Wow.
And that's one that has continuously been practiced since then. So I was taught this in 1997 in Bodh Gaya, the site where the Buddha was enlightened by one of my teachers. And, you know, according to the history, you know, his teacher received it from his teacher, and it, you know, goes all the way back. Now, I've taught this to correction officers, and I've taught this to inmates, and I've taught this to hospice patients, precisely because, like, you know, when you're dying, you're either obsessed with the past or you're really anticipating what's going to happen next, right? And if you're incarcerated, depending on what your experience is in that moment, you're either racking your brains around, like, what the hell did I do to get here, right? Or what the hell am I going to do to get out of here, right? And in both cases, you're not really necessarily open up to the experience of this moment right now, right? And yeah, there's, like, you know, for lack of a better term, there's bullshit and everything, right? There's, like, you know, being incarcerated, there's going to be fear and anxiety and sadness and dejection and anger. But the range of experiences happens at the same time, for somebody who's in the dying process. But with both groups, the thing that causes the arisal of those really difficult emotions is lack of ability to let go and rest. Right? When we let go and rest, so it's the same thing as you're saying in taking a shot and playing basketball, or as a painter, like kind of getting into that zone where you're really just, there is no division between the creative impulse and your arm and the paintbrush and the paint and the canvas. It's all just moving. And you see that with like Japanese ink washes, and a lot of Buddhist art is really about this just automatic expression. When we can express in that way, we don't even let the discursive mind have the room to hold on to create that suffering, right? So the application of these 6 nails, you could, have applications in finance. You could have this, applications in high level politics or negotiations, where there is probably there are more pitfalls that the discursive mind can create than one needs, right? So that's kind of like the kind of Western capitalistic way of looking at it. Like this will make us more efficient, but I think it's also a testament to the power of these instructions, where it doesn't matter who you are or where you are. These instructions have power, but you need to wrestle with them. You need to sit down and be like, let go. Let go of what's past. So like, my whole history. Let go of what may come. It hasn't even happened yet. But sometimes we're just like, next podcast this, or, like the next book this, or next week or tomorrow, blah, 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 and which is great, right? It's important. We need these things to function. We need calendars to be able to know what we're going to do next month, right? But there's also that kind of like neurotic quality to our relationship to past and future. But that act of just letting go and resting is beautiful. And it can happen anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well said. Well, Justin, my friend, this has been amazing. All the insights were great. And I especially love that meditation. And I think that even if people listen to this and they give that meditation a try, that for me was the gold, because it's such a simple application. And what we're talking about, some of it feels like it's out there, but it comes back to something. That's why I like Buddhism. Is very simple. It's very direct, and you can give it a try. You can try it immediately. And there's a reason why it's lasted this long, and there's a reason why so many people practice it. And there's room, I think, in our modern society for this way of thinking. It's a balance. It's a center point. And a lot of what I learned in Zen and in Buddhism, from what I study, is like, look, especially with the modern world, it's a balance. It's not like you're not doing the task list and things like that. It's just bringing a different level of awareness. And for any high performer, for an athlete, for a high level entrepreneur, for somebody to achieve success in the material world, as you can do that and have no grounding and be miserable. But if you can achieve material success of what you want, to have a home, to have a career, to have a vocation, to have happiness, these practices are fundamental, because it's your quality of consciousness. And when you have a high quality of consciousness, you can have nothing and you can have everything. And so if you can have both and have that middle way, this is who I am, this is how I'd like to express, and probably want to suffer less through understanding how my mind operates and be a little bit more deliberate. It's just such a fundamental and transformational thing that we don't need any of. I like, I'm in the new age community and I like a lot of the stuff, but there's also a reason why ancient traditions are ancient traditions, and so we can build on those practices and we can have the new stuff too. And there's a reason why the old stuff is still around. So, maybe give it a try. So what I'd like to ask, is there anything that you wish that I'd asked, or anything that you want to touch on before we close it out?
No, this has been great. This has been great. It's been fun. It's been, we've moved around. No, I want to thank you. I mean, it's been a joy to be, on your podcast, and yeah, you know, you're doing good work.
Oh, thanks, man. Well, you're doing really good work too. Hospice
Yeah.
is it's huge, man. I appreciate what you're doing and who you are, and helping and having that vocation, and doing something that you find meaningful and spreading that message. It's really beautiful. So thank you for what you do. If people want to get a hold of you, if they have any questions, they want to buy your book, which they should go buy your book, where should they go?
So you can get the book at Amazon.com. You can, small bookstores. It's out there. It's distributed by Penguin Random House. So you can look for it on Penguin's website as well. And then I have a website, justinvonboydash.com. Get in touch. People do. I teach students that way, and travel around and teach as well. When people want.
Awesome. Amazing. Well,
Yeah.
thanks for everything you're doing. Thanks for coming on the show and sharing what you do. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, man. Take care.
Yeah, my pleasure. See you guys. Peace.